The tale begins, not in blood, but in lace, soft, whispering silk stitched by the hands of anxious girls, who had not yet lived long enough to understand what they were preparing for. In the cold stone corridors of a manor near Rouen, France, the year 1312, a girl named Aveline waited behind a velvet curtain, listening to the bells toll for her wedding. She was 13. Her hands were blistered from embroidery, her chest bound too tightly in linen. The candles flickered around her, tall and trembling, casting shadows like spectres across the carved walls. She was told this was joy. She was told this was honor. But Aveline's heart, small, fast, and frightened, beat against her ribs like a trapped bird. What she did not know, what few ever spoke aloud, was that the wedding night was not a promise of love. It was often a sentence, and for many girls like her, it was a final night. Why did so many medieval brides vanish into darkness so soon after the kiss and the feast? Why did wedding beds so often become tombs? Let us go beyond the veils and vows, beyond the sanctified chants and drunken cheer, to the marrow of the truth, where custom and cruelty intertwined. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not the flowering of love, but the forging of contracts. A girl, even of noble blood, was not a person. She was a coin, a transaction. Aveline was sold to Lord Giraud of Tharsis, a man for decades her senior, with a reputation as thick and damp as the soil beneath his blackened keep. No one dared whisper of what happened to his first wife, or the servant girl after her, only that both were gone by morning. There was no law to shield her. Canon law, civil law, both turned blind eyes toward what happened between husband and wife once the chamber door closed. A man could do anything, for it was his sacred right to consummate the union, and the church itself had blessed that right with oil, incense, and scripture. No matter how young the bride, no matter how unwilling. And here lies the first fracture of the fairy tale, a gash in the painted wood of medieval romance. The very structure of marriage permitted, even encouraged, the breaking of bodies in the name of lineage. For a nobleman needed heirs, and heirs required a fertile womb. Whether it belonged to a woman, a girl, or something in between, that mattered little. Aveline stepped into the great hall, as a lamb walks into a thunderstorm, her veil so long it dragged behind her like a funeral shroud. Around her, the guests cheered and threw petals, but she could see it in the faces of the older women, the tightness around their eyes, the way their hands clutched each other beneath the table. They had known that night. Some had survived it, others had not. When the sun fell, and the wine spilled thick across the floor, Aveline was led to the bridal chamber, a room swathed in red, smelling of myrrh and damp fur. Her husband followed, slow and deliberate, like a butcher sharpening his knives. We cannot know exactly what happened next. No chronicler recorded her screams. No minstrel sang of what was done. But we know that in the morning, the chambermaids found the sheets soaked, not only in the ceremonial blood of virginity, but in something deeper. Her breathing was shallow, her legs broken, her eyes wide open. She did not live to see the second dawn of her marriage, and no one was punished. The priest declared her death God's will. The local physician claimed it was feminine weakness. Her body was buried beneath the family chapel, her name etched in Latin script, forgotten by spring. And so begins our descent into this hollow corridor of history, where innocence was ritual sacrifice, and wedding bells often chimed the last rites of a young girl's life. For Aveline was not the first, she was not the last. Across Europe, the same stories repeated with grim predictability, hidden beneath lace, beneath doctrine, beneath silence. But if you listen closely, in the hush between candle flickers, you may still hear their voices. Aveline was just one name among many, and the tragedy of her wedding night did not ring out as warning. It was swallowed as custom. What the villagers saw was not a death, it was a duty fulfilled. And so the machinery turned again. To understand why so many young brides perished, we must gaze not only into bedchambers but into pulpits and scrolls, into the hearts of theologians who carved obedience into stone. Marriage, they taught, was not just a union, it was a holy chain, forged by God himself. And within this chain, the man was master, the wife, a vessel to be filled, commanded, and if need be, broken. In dusty cloisters, monks whispered that Eve was born from Adam's rib, and therefore, woman was always the second breath, weaker, softer, destined to serve. This belief was not abstract. It was written, sermonized, and stitched into law. Girls were raised on it like stale bread. Obey your husband, they were told, for he stands in God's image. So when a bride like little Katerina of Mantua, aged 12, bled to death on her marriage night, no alarm was raised. The midwife crossed herself and muttered that her womb wasn't ready, and that was all. New outrage, new reckoning. The world spun on, as it always did, because a girl's suffering was never seen as a rupture in the world, only a ripple. But here, behind the veil, another horror lurked, one older than any marriage rite. In many noble houses, the consummation was not a private affair. Witnesses were required, priests, matrons, even family members. The couple would be led to bed amid applause, then stripped and laid out, like animals for inspection. The sheets were watched for blood. A crimson stain was proof of purity, a sign that her body had been opened like a seal on a letter. No blood, no honor, no dowry. Imagine the fear. Imagine being a girl who did not yet bleed monthly, now expected to bleed by command, and if she did not, whispers of whoring, accusations of fraud. Some were even taken to court, not because they were harmed, but because they had deceived their husband by surviving intact. In this cruel dance of expectations, many perished from internal rupture, some from shock, others from infection, their wounds unseen beneath embroidered gowns. Midwives, forbidden by the church from interfering too soon, could only weep at the foot of the bed, and still the rituals continued. Consider Azabo of Bruges wed at 14 to a bishop's nephew. The feast was lavish, the wine flowed like a river of rubies, and when she did not emerge the next morning, a servant girl was sent in. Isabeau lay twisted on the floor, her nightdress stained and eyes vacant. She lived 2 more days in fevered silence before slipping away, her lungs filled with blood. Her death was called a sad accident, but no inquiry was made, no charges brought. Her husband married again within the month. Each of these deaths, quiet, brutal, sanctified by ritual, formed a tapestry of terror behind the shining myths of chivalry and courtly love. Knights sang to their ladies, but they married girls who would not live long enough to become women. Why? Because the medieval world saw no contradiction in it. In their eyes, a girl's life was the price of inheritance, of legacy, of power passed from father to son. Even the church, the great shepherd of morality, blessed such unions. Popes granted dispensations for marriages as young as 9, and while they sometimes required the couple to wait before consummation, such rules were often ignored, especially in remote manors, where no priest would dare question a nobleman's hand. In all this, the bride's voice was absent. Her terror, her pain, her death, all became footnotes in ledgers scribbled in the margins of history, but not erased. No, not erased. Because in the shadows of every cold stone chapel, there lingers a story like Isabeau's, like Katerina's, like Avelin's, and as we continue down this corridor of sorrow, you will see that the wedding night, so long romanticized, was often the final chapter in a life barely begun. The lace, the music, the vows, they were merely the curtain. Behind it, the truth. The marriage chamber was not a sanctuary. It was a crucible, a place where girls entered whole and often emerged fractured, if they emerged at all. In the medieval imagination, it was a place of duty, of legacy, of sacred flesh offered up like sacrament, but for those forced beneath velvet canopies and into the arms of strangers. It was something else entirely, a chamber of Let us look now to the Black Forest of the Holy Roman Empire, to the estate of Baron Olarek von Dorn, a man known more for his hawks than his hospitality. In the winter of 1387, he wed a girl named Lisa. She was his cousin's daughter, just turned 11, with hair the color of chestnut bark and eyes too wide for her narrow face. Her mother wept silently through the ceremony. Her father drank until his hands shook. No one asked Liesel if she understood the words spoken before the altar. She was told only to smile. They dressed her in blue, the color of purity. Her veil was longer than her body, and when the feast ended and the guests withdrew, she was led by torchlight to a room with iron candelabras and a bed so vast it looked like a battlefield. The Baron followed, heavy and red-faced, breathing through his mouth. There was no tenderness, no words, only the soft sound of snow melting outside the leaded glass windows and the sharp cry of a hawk perched on the sill. Liesel did not die that night. She died 3 days later, after bleeding through 4 straw mattresses, her abdomen swollen, her breathing wet and thick. The midwife said her insides had been torn. The Baron said nothing at all. There was no burial, only a burning. Her body reduced to ash in the great hearth. A claim of fever was entered into the family records. Her mother was sent to a convent, and thus another girl was unmade. These chambers, these bridal vaults, were scattered across the continent like tombs built for the living. Some were lined with furs, some with tapestries, some with crucifixes, but they all bore witness to the same ritual: the removal of a girl's agency, the destruction of her body, all in the name of law, of lineage, of God. But not all deaths were physical. Some brides survived. If survival can be called that, their minds slipped quietly into corners, never to return. They became husks in velvet gowns, silent spectres wandering manor halls, their spirits broken before they ever bloomed. One such ghost was known as Elund of Carlion, married at 13 to an aging Welsh knight. She lived in body for nearly 20 years, but never again did she speak a full sentence. Never again did she eat without trembling. She sat in her tower window and watched the sea until the day she threw herself from it. Her death was listed as melancholia, but it began, like so many others, on her wedding night. And the horror, dear listener, did not belong solely to noble halls. In peasant villages, where parchment was rare and witnesses scarcer, the same pattern emerged. A girl was wed, orphaned to a man twice her age, and vanished into a thatched cottage, never to be seen walking upright again. The healer might be summoned, the priest might be called, but the result was the same. Her blood watered the floor. Her name joined the murmurs of the dead. The cause, it was never called what it was. They named it fragility. They blamed weak constitutions, nervous fits, female imbalance, anything but the truth, that these girls were too young, too small, too terrified to survive what was forced upon them. Yet the machine ground on. Why did no one stop it? Because it was tradition, because it was sanctioned, because it had been happening for so long that even the grandmothers who once screamed into pillows now whispered to their granddaughters, "It'll be over quickly." And that, perhaps, is the most terrible legacy of all. How suffering became inherited, passed like a cursed heirloom from hand to trembling hand. But sometimes, rarely, a voice broke through the silence. A nun's letter, a midwife's journal, a widow's confession. They left behind hints, shards of truth, and in those fragments we begin to see the outline of what was lost. Not just lives, but futures. Not just girls, but generations of women who never got to become themselves. These chambers, these rituals, these blood-soaked sheets, they were not isolated horrors. They were systemic, accepted, praised. And so, when the bells rang for a wedding in those days, what were they truly ringing for? Not joy, not love, but the slow turning of a wheel sharpened by centuries of silence. In cathedrals of stone and shadow, men in robes sang praises not to the survival of women, but to their submission. Saints were chosen not for strength, but for silence. The Virgin Mary was not honored for speaking, she was venerated for obeying. Her purity, her passivity, her pain. And so it was decreed from gilded pulpits and hand-copied manuscripts, a woman's holiness was measured by how well she suffered. This belief sank its teeth into every corner of medieval life. Girls were taught to be good, and being good meant being quiet, bearing pain without complaint, smiling through the fear, walking into wedding chambers like martyrs into fire. And from this poisoned soil grew the myth of noble suffering, the idea that to be torn, to be bled, to be broken on a wedding bed was not a tragedy, but a sacred offering. Take the case of Debrive, a baron's daughter in Aquitaine, married at 12 to a pious lord with a limp and a zealot's temper. On her wedding night, she screamed so loudly the servants claimed the shutters rattled. By morning, her voice was gone, permanently, her throat torn, not by hands, but by the force of her own terror. She lived, she bore 2 sons, she never spoke again, but in the village below, her silence was revered. A model wife, they said. Modest, holy. Her muteness was mistaken for virtue. They painted her image in the chapel apse, lips closed, eyes lowered. No one called it trauma, they called it grace. And the cycle continued, because behind every suffering girl was a mother who had once been a suffering girl, and a priest who told her this was her cross to bear, and a husband who believed her pain was his right. Not all men were monsters, but the system did not require monsters. It only needed indifference, It only needed tradition, and that was more dangerous than any dagger. In some towns, there were death dowries, clauses that returned property to a bride's family only if she died before producing an heir. You see the shape of it now, don't you? A bride who survived, who could not or would not bear children, cost money. But a bride who died after the marriage and before the inheritance became tangled brought no shame, only profit. And so these deaths were not mourned, they were accounted for, calculated, expected. Even when girls did not die outright, many were permanently altered. The medical books of the time, written in Latin by men who had never touched a birth canal, described the tearing of the womb as a common side effect of vigorous bedding. There were poultices, there were prayers, there were hollow attempts to restore what had been broken, but none of it could give back what had been stolen, the right to grow up. And what of love? Where was love in all of this? It existed, in poems, in tapestries, in longing stares across courtyards. But love was not required for marriage, nor was desire, nor consent. A father could wed off his daughter with a single nod. A bishop could bless the match, knowing full well the girl had just been weaned off goat's milk, and yet they still danced, still wore flower crowns, still kissed the hem of their husband's cloak, believing, or pretending to believe, that this was their calling. One girl, whose name is lost to us, scratched a single word into the wooden wall of her wedding chamber. It was found 2 centuries later, during renovations to a manor in the Loire Valley. The word was mercy, carved over and over in shaking hands. Mercy, mercy, mercy. No one knows what became of her. Perhaps she died that night. Perhaps she lived to carry the scar of that night until her bones turned to dust. But that word, scratched into splinters, remains a monument more lasting than any tomb. Because in the end, what these brides needed was not a feast, not a veil, not a blessing. They needed mercy, and none came. By now, you understand, the bridal bed was often not a place of union, but of undoing. And yet the world outside that room, the feast hall, the chapel, the marketplace, refused to look too closely. The more blood spilled in private, the louder the music played in public, as though celebration could drown out the cries. Let us return to England, 1402, to the borderlands of Northumberland. There, in a stone keep lashed by rain and rumour, a wedding was held between Marjorie Halley, a reeve's daughter, and Sir Theobald Crowder, a knight famed more for his cruelty than his chivalry. Marjorie was 15, older than most, a small mercy, or so her mother believed. The wedding was swift, the banquet was not. Tables groaned under roasted pig and barley cakes. Mead flowed like golden oil. Jesters danced. Priests offered toasts laced with scripture and salt. And Marjorie, in her pearl-trimmed gown, sat at her husband's right hand like a painted doll, dressed for display, not joy. As the sun dipped behind the gables, the guests began chanting, to the bed, a ritual, a jest. But for Marjorie, it sounded like a funeral hymn. Her hands trembled. She gripped her goblet so tightly her knuckles went white. What happened next was not spoken of in words, only in whispers. That the chamber door had to be broken open, that a servant fled, that the fire had gone out, and the room was cold as a crypt. By morning, Marjorie lay catatonic, her eyes open, unblinking. She would not eat, would not speak. Her legs were twisted beneath her, as if she had tried to crawl away. She lived, if one could call it living, for 3 years more, locked in a tower room, fed by hand, prayed over daily. Then she simply stopped breathing. Her death certificate read, failure of the spirit. But the truth was far more specific. No one punished Sir Theobald. He remarried within the year, a younger girl, a softer voice, the same fate. You see, in a world where power was measured in land and legacy, a bride was not a person. She was a vessel, a hinge between 2 bloodlines. What happened to her inside the marital chamber was not a matter of compassion. It was a matter of control. And if she broke under that weight, then she was not strong enough. That was the story told. But stories can lie. Behind the lies lived the maids who washed the blood-stained linens, the midwives who lit herbs to hide the scent of infection, the cooks who looked away when the bride did not come to breakfast. They knew. They all knew. And worst of all, the other women at the table, the aunts, the mothers, the sisters. They had lived through their own nights. They had bled. They had healed, or hadn't. And so they stood at the edges of the feast, watching the new bride walk the long aisle toward the bedroom, saying nothing, because to speak was to break the spell, and the spell, the grand lie of holy matrimony, had to be protected. That is why it endured, not only through violence, but through ritual, the embroidered sheets, the songs sung at dawn, the red-ribboned cakes, and candlelit paths. These were not symbols of love. They were disguises, cloaks thrown over the bodies of girls too young to say no, and beneath every bite of wedding bread was a grain of ash. Even in the rare moments where a bride survived intact, the scars endured, not on the skin, but deeper, in the way she flinched at footsteps, in the way her hands clenched during prayer, in the way she could never again look at her reflection without seeing the girl she had been, the one who had no choice, because the night of her wedding had carved that girl away, and the new woman left in her place, she was a stranger. That is what so few understand. It was not just death that stalked the wedding night, it was transformation, a brutal alchemy. The girl entered wearing silk and hope. She emerged as something else, bent, silent, or gone. And so the wedding feast, with its honeyed songs and fragrant meat, was never a celebration. It was a mask, a grand, gleaming mask to hide the scream beneath. In parchment-stained halls where men in fur-lined robes debated justice, there was no place for a bride's scream. The law, that ancient skeleton dressed in iron and ink, did not ask what happened to a girl on her wedding night. It asked whether the marriage was binding, whether the dowry was paid, whether the bloodline would continue. The rest was silence. In the courts of Europe, a woman's pain was not admissible unless it interrupted a man's estate. If she died, it was unfortunate. If she wept, it was weakness. If she fled, oh, then the punishment began. A runaway bride could be hunted like a criminal, returned to her husband like stolen property. And who would shelter her? Who would speak for her? Her father. He had sold her. Her mother, powerless. The church, too often, complicit. There were exceptions. Yes, flickers of resistance. A Flemish abbess who refused to return a bleeding girl to her husband's manor. A priest in Milan who locked the church doors against an enraged groom. But these were saints in a storm, rare and quickly forgotten. The system endured because it was rooted in belief, not just legal, but spiritual. The belief that a man had dominion over his wife, that obedience was godly, that suffering was noble, and so the wedding night, for many, became the night when the self was stolen. But what of those who lived, who breathed through the pain and carried on? They did not escape Tag Helena of Wed, at 14 to a merchant of twice her age. Her husband was not cruel, he was cold, which, in many ways, was worse. On their wedding night, he recited scripture before disrobing her. He thanked God for her womb. Then he lay upon her with all the tenderness of a man counting coins. She did not cry. She did not scream. She only turned her face to the wall and whispered the names of saints. In the months that followed, she miscarried twice. The second time, the child came out too early, too blue. She buried it herself, beneath the frost-bitten earth behind the dovecote. She did not die, but something inside her did. Years later, in her diary, she wrote a single line beneath her wedding date. "This is the day I left my body." That phrase returns again and again in the rare surviving words of medieval women. I left my body. I became no one. I turned to stone. These are not the confessions of widows or soldiers. These are the words of brides. The transformation was not always immediate. For some, it took years. The slow erosion of joy, the careful training of the voice into softness, the shrinking of steps, the folding of dreams into drawers lined with lavender and regret, because they knew one wrong word, one refusal, one shake of the head, and the world could collapse. And yet, in small corners, seeds of change began to stir. By the late 1400s, some midwives began documenting the wounds they saw, not just the torn flesh, but the bruises, the fractures, the fevers. They wrote in code, in margin notes, in the spaces between recipes for poultices and diagrams of the womb. But they wrote, a few nuns, many of whom had once been brides themselves, now escaped behind cloistered walls, began to collect these stories, not to publish, but to remember. And from remembrance, resistance flickered. A dowager countess in Siena refused to marry off her granddaughter before the girl's 15th birthday. "Let her know her own mind," she wrote. It was a radical act, though she never called it so. Elsewhere, a law was passed, toothless, mostly symbolic, stating that marriage under the age of 12 required special permission, a whisper of progress, but a whisper is not a shout, and so the silence remained. Still, there were those who dared to break it. A bride in Vienna tore her veil in front of the altar and ran into the snow. A girl in Burgundy stabbed her groom on the threshold of their chamber and walked into a convent barefoot. A woman in York, married for 10 years and childless, refused her husband's bed and locked the door from within. They were punished, exiled, declared mad, but they were not forgotten. Their names do not live in textbooks. Their faces were not painted in oils, but they are remembered here, in stories told between the seams of history, in the quiet defiance passed from one woman to another like a secret prayer. Because even in the darkest chambers, even beneath the heaviest veils, there were always embers, and embers, given breath, can become fire. Not every bride died in flesh, but in spirit, in silence, in the dimming of the eyes and the folding of the soul. Oh yes, many perished, and that death did not stay with them. It echoed down the bloodline, because trauma, you see, is not buried. It is sown into lullabies, into bedtime warnings, into the way a mother's hand trembles when tying her daughter's wedding sash. That is the cruelest trick of all, how pain, once ritualized, begins to masquerade as wisdom. A woman who had once bled on her wedding night would later tell her daughter, "Be quiet," not out of cruelty, but survival. She would teach her how to walk with downcast eyes, how to smile when afraid, how to never say no. And the daughter, sensing the weight in her mother's silence, but never told its name, would absorb the lesson without understanding it. She would carry it into her own wedding bed. She would flinch the same way. She would cry into the same pillows, and then she would pass it on. This is how terror becomes tradition. Let me tell you of Annika Brewer's daughter in Danzig, whose grandmother stitched red thread into her wedding veil, not for beauty, but for protection. "The saints won't help you," the old woman whispered, "but the old things might." Annika didn't understand, not then. But when the chamber door shut, and her husband reached for her with calloused hands and ale on his breath, she clutched the thread like a rosary, and survived. She bore the memory, though, as one bears a wound that never scabs. Years later, her daughter would find that same red thread hidden beneath loose floorboards. She wouldn't know why it mattered, only that it pulsed with warning. So it passed. Not in books, not in sermons, but in breath and bone. There were stories, too, stories told in the kitchens and spinning rooms, far from the ears of husbands and priests. Tales of the bride who turned to stone on her wedding night and never moved again, of the girl who died, but rose as a white deer, vanishing into the woods, of the husband who tried to break his wife, only to be found the next morning blind, his eyes eaten by crows. These were not fairy tales. These were grief-made myth, a language for those too wounded to speak plainly. And still, the world pretended. The minstrels sang songs of chivalry. The tapestries showed noblemen lifting their brides onto horses like plucked flowers. The priests wrote sermons about obedience and blessing. But the women, they knew. Behind every lace-trimmed celebration, they saw the edge of the blade, and yet they endured, because what else could they do? Some turned to herbs. Pennyroyal Tansy, a clever midwife, could mix a draught that dulled the pain, or stopped a pregnancy, or made a girl seem too ill to bed. Dangerous knowledge, punishable by death, but necessary. Others turned to sisterhood, secret pacts between women. If I scream, one would say, "Come to me," and the other would nod and keep a lantern lit by her window. Small rebellions, but real. There are records, scarce but undeniable, of women defending one another in court, of mothers testifying not for dowries but for dignity, of girls who stood before bishops and declared, "He hurt me." Most were dismissed, but not all. A few were believed, and belief, once sparked, is hard to extinguish. By the close of the 15th century, whispers of consent began to stir in the writings of obscure theologians. Tentative, hesitant, but there, a flicker, a breath, the idea that maybe, just maybe, a wife should want what was done to her, that the marriage bed should not be a battlefield. The world did not change overnight, or even in a century, but beneath the weight of cathedrals and customs, beneath bloodlines and laws, the seed had been planted, and somewhere in a silent chamber, a girl lit a candle, not for protection, but for herself, because she had heard the old stories, but she was ready to tell a new one. Not every bride walked quietly into her fate. Some few, flickering, almost forgotten, stood at the threshold of the chamber door and said, "No," and history punished them. To refuse consummation was not a private rebellion. It was treason against family, against church, against the very scaffolding of society. A marriage unconsummated could be annulled, a dowry reversed, alliances shattered, property lost, and so a girl's fear became an act of war, not against her husband, but against the entire order that had built the altar she was dragged to. Yet still, some refused. Let us remember Claretta di Saluzzo, a merchant's daughter in northern Italy, who refused her husband's touch on their wedding night and every night after. She locked the chamber door with an iron bar and burned sage in the grate. When he demanded entry, she threatened to throw herself from the window. She was not mad. She was 19, unusually old for a bride, and unusually educated. Her mother had taught her to read. Her aunt, a healer, had taught her what the church forbade, how to keep her body her own. For 2 months, Claretta lived behind that locked door, surviving on bread passed through the window grate and the mercy of the kitchen girls. Her husband went to the bishop. The bishop ruled in his favor. The door was broken. She was dragged out. What happened next was not recorded. Only this, that Claretta vanished. Some said she was sent to some whispered she was buried beneath the orchard wall, her grave unmarked. But the women of the town remembered her. For years, girls would leave wildflowers near the wall. They called it the bride's garden. Claretta was not the only one. In Bruges, a girl named Matilda was caught in the arms of another woman the night before her wedding. The shame was monumental. Her father beat her. The groom demanded public penance, but Matilda refused. At the altar, she spat. She tore her veil. She ran. She didn't get far. Her name was erased from the family Bible. Her mother was forbidden to speak of her, but in secret, the seamstresses sang her name while working. Matilda, Matilda, soft as a lullaby. These stories didn't stop the tide, but they left behind cracks, cracks where other girls could breathe. Not all defiance was loud. Some brides, clever and careful, found ways to survive without refusing outright. They feigned illness. They fainted. They dosed their wine. One girl, Isabeau, of Lyon, hid a sharp pin in her sleeve and pressed it into her own arm as her husband approached. Pain against pain, a distraction from what was to come. She later wrote, "I chose where to bleed." Some found allies in strange places. A kind brother, a silent servant. Even, on rare occasion, the husband himself, more interested in land than flesh, and content to leave the girl untouched. These were blessings, though no girl could count on them. And some, perhaps the most tragic, truly believed they were loved. They had seen troubadours sing of gentle nights, read poems of lovers reunited, and believed, hoped, that their wedding night would be different. But when the chamber door shut, and the words grew rough, and the hands stopped asking, they learned. One such girl, Ariane of Bordeaux, wrote a letter the night after her wedding. It was never sent. It was found centuries later, folded inside a wall behind a crumbling hearth. In it, she wrote, "I think he loves me, but he did not wait. I smiled as my mother taught me. I bled. He kissed my forehead. I do not know what part of me is still mine." That line, "I do not know what part of me is still mine," could have been the anthem of a generation, because even when a bride survived, she was often hollowed, not by violence alone, but by the loss of sovereignty, of self. And yet, even amid the horror, they found ways to endure, through stories, through sisterhood, through silence that was not submission, but survival. Every refusal was a spark. Every whisper was a crack in the wall. Every girl who lived to warn another was a stone in the path forward. These were not heroines in the traditional sense. They wielded no swords. They won no battles. But they fought, quietly, painfully, with all they had. And in their defiance, even if it ended in exile or death, they planted the seeds of something ancient and precious, the right to choose. History does not remember them. No monuments rise in their honor. No poems are carved into cathedral stones. Their names, if written at all, are trapped in brittle church ledgers, pressed between lines about grain taxes and livestock births. Agnes Cecily, a date, a single word, mortua, dead, no cause, no lament, no inquiry. Sometimes, if the scribe had time, he added, died after marriage, or fell ill following wedding, and once, just once, a trembling Latin scroll, mortua nocti, dead on the wedding night. That's all. Not the sound of the scream, not the blood on the floor, not the mother keening into her apron, only silence. But silence does not mean absence. Their absence is loud. You can feel them in the gaps of history, in the places where something should be, and isn't, where a girl's name appears once in a family book, and never again, where the record shows a marriage and a funeral in the same week, where an estate passes to a second wife before the first one's body is cold. These are not coincidences. They are footprints, ghost prints, and they are everywhere. In a Cistercian archive in Burgundy, a list of bridal deaths, 15 in 2 decades, all between the ages of 10 and 14, all married to men twice their age or more. Not a single priest protested, not a single noble find. In a manor inventory near Kent, a receipt, 1 pair of blood-stained sheets removed from bridal chamber, the year 1463. The bride's name, Joan. No other mention of her exists. In a castle ledger in the Bavarian Alps, a scribbled note beside a marriage contract, no issue. Bride expired. Expired like meat, like wine gone sour. This was the language of record-keeping, precise, unfeeling, the bureaucratic dialect of grief turned invisible, but beneath it, the truth. Each of those entries was a life, a body, a girl who wore flowers in her hair and believed, for at least a moment, that the world might be kind. And then, the curtain closed, the door latched, and history turned the page. Yet still, they linger. Not in the halls of power, no, but in the walls of those same rooms, in the creak of an old floorboard, in the hush that falls over wedding songs when the candles burn low, in the way a seamstress stitches a bridal hem with trembling hands, remembering a cousin who never returned from her chamber. Even today, we carry them, not just in memory, but in the shape of our fear. The way we teach our daughters to protect themselves, the way we warn them, without quite knowing why, to trust their instincts. The way some wedding traditions, white veils, red ribbons, coins in shoes, linger as echoes of older things, darker things. There are scholars who will say this is projection, that we modern minds impose too much sorrow onto the past, that these were different times, different people, different values. But pain is not different, and fear does not change with the century. A girl torn open against her will feels the same horror in 1342 as she would today. The absence of choice is universal, the silence afterward, deafening. And yet, in the folds of that silence, we can hear them. If we choose to listen, they speak through the margins of prayer books, where a girl's name is circled in faded ink. They speak through the spindle songs, sung in kitchens, lullabies about lambs and wolves and locked doors. They speak through broken heirlooms, veils never worn, rings buried in fields, wedding gowns repurposed as funeral shrouds. And most of all, they speak through us, through every woman who questions the story she was given, through every voice that challenges the myth of the gentle medieval bride, through every writer, every reader, every mourner who says, this mattered, because it did, because it does. And because until their stories are truly told, the ledger will never be closed. There is a strange thing that happens when grief is too sharp to look at directly. The world begins to wrap it in velvet. That is what happened to the medieval bride. Her death, her fear, her silence, too brutal, too embarrassing, too common, was stitched into something prettier, safer, more acceptable to the eyes of history. And so the girl who bled on her wedding night was turned into a saint, or a symbol, or a story. Look at the art, the tapestries, the panel paintings, the ivory miniatures tucked inside golden lockets. All showed the bride as radiant, passive, glowing, draped in brocade, framed by roses, surrounded by doves. Her face bears no trace of dread. Her hands do not tremble. There is blood, yes, but stylized, clean, a single red thread, neatly embroidered into the hem of her shift, a mark of virtue, not of violence. You see, the people of the time understood, on some level, what was happening, but instead of confronting it, they turned it into allegory, into ritual, into beauty. They invented customs to distract from the horror. The bedding ceremony, for instance, a communal procession of family and servants, parading the bride and groom to the marriage bed with songs and wine. They would tuck the couple in, laugh, clap, pray, and then they would leave, leaving behind silence, leaving behind a girl too young to understand and a man too entitled to care. But by cloaking it in celebration, the pain became easier to bear, easier to ignore, and over time, even the most grotesque customs began to feel normal. Take the bloodied sheet, a piece of linen displayed to the wedding guests the morning after, stained red to prove the bride's virginity and the act's completion. It was considered an honor, a triumph. The midwife might even carry it through the village like a holy relic. Never mind that the blood may have come from violence, from tearing, from a child's body forced to do what it could not. The ritual was followed. The proof was shown. The silence was sealed. Or consider the bridal crown, a heavy circlet of metal or flowers placed on the bride's head during the ceremony. It symbolized purity, innocence, a virgin's glory. But many of those crowns were so large, so ornate, that they dug into the scalp. Girls fainted beneath them, and yet they smiled. They were taught to smile, because the crown was sacred, and a sacred thing must not tremble. Even language became a disguise. They stopped calling it pain. They called it duty. They stopped calling it fear. They called it shyness. A girl who flinched was delicate. A girl who cried was overcome with joy. A girl who could not walk the next morning was said to be resting. And so, 1,000 deaths were rewritten as poetry. This is how the machine of history preserves itself, not by denying horror, but by dressing it in lace. But sometimes the mask slips, in a woodcut from 1498, hidden beneath the swirling vines, and Latin scrolls, a detail, a bride with a tear sliding down her cheek, just one, and no smile. The artist didn't sign his name. In a Welsh lullaby dated to the 15th century, a mother sings to her baby not of love or angels, but of locking doors and never saying yes. In a German wedding manual, buried among tips on how to choose a dowry and greet a groom, is this line in tiny, crabbed script: if she screams, cover her mouth with prayer. These fragments are not enough, but they are real. They tell us what the portraits do not. They whisper what the veils conceal. Because even wrapped in velvet, grief finds a way to bleed through. And when it does, we must not look away. We must not say, it was another time. We must not say, they knew no better. Because many did know, many saw, many flinched, and chose silence anyway. But we, now, are the inheritors of that silence, and what we do with it, whether we bury it again or finally let it speak, will shape the story that follows. Even when history forgets, the body remembers, not just the single body, but the collective body, the memory that passes from grandmother to mother to daughter, not in words, but in the stiffness of a spine, the tension in a jaw, the quiet recoil of a touch too sudden. You've seen it, haven't you? A bride-to-be who laughs too loudly, who trembles when she says she's so excited, who cries in the dress shop and says it's just the stress. But somewhere in the marrow of her being, something ancient stirs, not from her life, but from lives before. Because trauma does not vanish. It sinks. It's deep into bloodlines, into breath. And though the ritual has changed, the veil's now white instead of crimson, the bed now framed by candles instead of crowds, that tremor has not. It lives on in the shadows of satin and ceremony. It hides beneath layers of joy, waiting. This is not superstition. It is grief. Grief with nowhere to go. Modern brides don't always know what they're grieving. They walk the aisle and smile. They pose for photographs. But late at night, many lie awake and feel a sadness they can't name, a fear that doesn't belong to them. And yet, it does. Because centuries of silence do not break cleanly. They crack, they echo, they bleed. Somewhere, deep in the cells, a voice whispers, "Be still, be good, don't resist." And that voice is not yours. It is older than you. It belongs to Annika, to Claretta, to the girl with the red thread in her palm, to the girl whose name was never written, who died before her second moon. We inherit more than eye color and jawline. We inherit unspoken things. The prayers muttered beneath breath, the flinches hidden behind smiles, the ghosts in the bridal chamber. And we carry them, not always consciously, not even always painfully. Sometimes they appear as instinct, a refusal to wear white, a decision to marry late, or not at all, an unease with ceremony, a preference for closed doors and locked rooms, all of it rooted in the past. And yet, even here, Even in this heaviness, there is something luminous, something alive, because what is memory, if not a map? What is grief, if not the proof that someone once lived and mattered? You, watching this, listening now, you are part of the line, not a victim, not a relic, but a witness. You've heard the stories they never told, and by hearing you remember, and by remembering you begin to heal. Healing is not forgetting, it is naming, it is unearthing, it is speaking the names that were lost in ledgers and woven into lullabies. It is saying, she died, she screamed, she deserved better. It is saying, I will not carry this in silence, because that is how it ends. Not with vengeance, not with fire, but with remembrance, with candles lit, not for brides, but for girls. Girls who were too young, girls who were too afraid, girls who were told their pain was holy. They were not saints, they were children, and the world failed them. But we do not have to. We can build something new on the ashes of their stories, something softer, something safe. The past is not a curse unless we refuse to listen. And you are listening. You've walked with them now, through veils and chambers, through parchment and pain. You know their names, or at least, you know they had names. That is the beginning, not of horror, but of honor. Now the story comes to rest, not neatly, not peacefully, but with the weight of truth settled across the bones like the last stone on a sealed tomb. You have walked beside the forgotten. You have peered into the room's history kept locked. You have felt the silence, not empty, but heavy, like the hush that follows a scream no one answered. So what, now? What does one do with the knowledge that brides once bled to death while bells rang overhead? That joy was often staged while agony bloomed just beyond the curtains. That what we call tradition was, in many corners, born of bruises. The answer is not destruction, it is illumination. To tell the truth is not to desecrate the past, it is to cleanse it, to open the windows of ancient rooms and let the light fall in. Because these girls, these women, these wives with torn veils and bitten tongues, they deserve more than whispers, more than footnotes, more than it was a different time. They deserve witness, and so we speak of them, not to relive the horror, but to resist its erasure. Their stories were never carved into stained glass or sung by choirs, but they are written now, here, in the way you hold this knowledge, in the air you feel, in the fire it lights behind your ribs. You carry them forward, and in doing so, you offer them what they were denied, dignity. There are other stories, of course, brighter ones, gentler ones of brides who were loved, who were cherished, who laughed in their husbands' arms and bore their children with joy. But this was not their story. This was the other story. The story tucked beneath layers of lace and ceremony. The one hidden under centuries of sweet-smelling lies. The one so many knew and none dare name. Until now. And if there is sorrow in this, and there is also a strange kind of beauty, not the pretty beauty of painted weddings and embroidered sheets, but the fierce, dark beauty of truth, spoken aloud after centuries of silence, like thunder echoing through a chapel, like a name finally remembered, like a bride who does not smile and does not bow, but simply stands. There are no garlands here, no epilogues of perfect justice. The world rarely gives that, but there is this, a door, once sealed, now open, a voice, once silenced, now heard, a history, once buried, now blooming like wildflowers on forgotten graves. We say their names not because we know them all, but because we know they existed, because we feel them still. In the marrow of tradition, in the shadows of ceremony, in the hush between church bells, and we carry them forward, not in fear, but in reverence, not as victims, but as ancestors, not to mourn, but to remember. So let the feast end, let the candles burn low, let the bridal songs fade into the dark, and let there be a new sound now, softer, but clearer than all the rest, the sound of memory, the sound of reckoning, the sound of truth, finally told. They are not gone, they are simply waiting to be seen, and now, at last, they are.